Miss Marple and the Widows' Club, where members never left. Chapter 1. An invitation most peculiar. The afternoon post at St. Mary Mead arrived with its usual predictability, catalogues, and the occasional circular advertising remedies for ailments Miss Marple had no intention of acquiring. But this Tuesday, in late September, brought something altogether different. A cream-colored envelope bearing her name in elegant calligraphy. Miss Jane Marple, aged 83 and considerably more observant than most people twice her age, held the invitation at arm's length, studying it through her spectacles. "The Widows' Club," it announced, "cordially invites you to join our circle of mutual support and companionship. Established 1952, discretion guaranteed." She set it aside on her writing desk, among the geraniums in her correspondence, and did not open it until she had finished her morning correspondence. Miss Marple believed in proper order, one task completed before another began. This habit, cultivated over decades, had served her well in matters both trivial and serious. The invitation came from a Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the club's current president. The address was Rosewood Manor, situated on the outskirts of Little Bramble, a village some 12 miles distant. Miss Marple knew the house by reputation, a Victorian mansion, somewhat grand for the neighborhood, owned for the past 3 years by a woman who kept largely to herself. The gardens were said to be lovely, though few villagers had actually seen them. Within the hour, the telephone rang. Miss Marple answered it herself. She found it mattered little whether one had a telephone or not, if one took the trouble to answer it promptly. Miss Marple. Wonderful. A woman's voice, cultured, but with an edge of calculation beneath the warmth. "I do hope you received my invitation. I'm Eleanor Vance. We have a mutual acquaintance. Your nephew, Raymond, speaks of you constantly." This was precisely the sort of thing that made Miss Marple sit up straighter. Her nephew Raymond spoke to very few people about his aunt. That someone had extracted this information suggested a certain persistence, or perhaps a certain intimacy with Raymond's affairs. "How kind," Miss Marple replied carefully, "though I confess I'm rather occupied with my garden at this time of year. The roses require such attention before the frost arrives." Of course, Mrs. Vance continued smoothly. "But surely you might spare an evening. We hold our meetings on the 3rd Thursday of each month. Dinner, conversation, cards. Nothing taxing. A small circle of ladies who have found themselves in similar circumstances. Solitude, the need for understanding, companionship." Miss Marple listened to what was said and, more importantly, to what was not said. The invitation was not truly an invitation. It was a test, or perhaps a challenge. There was something almost predatory in the cheerfulness of Mrs. Vance's tone. "I am not actually a widow," Miss Marple said mildly. "I have never married." A pause. When Mrs. Vance spoke again, her voice had subtly altered. "How interesting. Yet I understood from Raymond that you had experienced significant loss." "I have experienced life," Miss Marple replied, "as we all do. But I'm afraid your club might find my circumstances rather different from what you seek." "Perhaps that would make you all the more valuable to us," Mrs. Vance said. An outside perspective. Someone accustomed to observation. That word observation hung between them like a skein of thread in the morning light. Miss Marple became very still. "I shall think about it," she said finally. After she hung up the telephone, she sat in her armchair for some considerable time, the invitation resting on her lap. She thought about Raymond, who was cautious by nature and rarely spoke of his family to strangers. She thought about a woman named Eleanor Vance, apparently prosperous enough to maintain a large country house, who nonetheless felt compelled to recruit members into a widows' club. She thought about the phrase, "where members never left," printed in small letters at the bottom of the invitation, which she had initially read as a promise, but which might just as easily be read as a threat. 3 days later, Miss Marple made her decision. She would attend. The drive to Little Bramble took her through countryside she had not seen in some years, rolling hills softening into autumn, hedgerows still lush with late September green. Her taxi driver, a taciturn man named Mr. Pettigrew, commented on the state of the harvest and the likelihood of rain before the week's end. Miss Marple contributed little to the conversation, preferring to observe the village as they passed through it. Little Bramble was one of those English villages that had changed less in 30 years than it had in the 300 preceding. The church sat at its heart, surrounded by tidy cottages and a post office that seemed to serve as the nerve centre of village life. There was a small market, a pub called the Crown and Anchor, and a library that occupied what had once been a private residence. Miss Marple noted that the library lights were on, though it was nearly 6 in the evening, and a woman of perhaps 60 was just locking the door as they drove past. Rosewood Manor revealed itself gradually as the taxi wound up a private lane, bordered by overgrown rhododendrons. The house was indeed Victorian, but Miss Marple found herself startled by its condition. The grounds were meticulously maintained, too meticulously, she thought. The gardens had the sterile perfection of a photograph, all order and no wildness. Not a rose hung unpruned, not a hedge grew unchecked. 3 cars were already parked in the circular drive. Miss Marple noted their registrations with the casual attention of someone accustomed to noticing details. A Rolls-Royce of some vintage, a practical Rover, a newer Morris, slightly dented on the off-dash side. Mrs. Eleanor Vance stood in the entry hall when the door opened. She was perhaps 65, with the careful appearance of a woman who had invested considerable time and money in her presentation. Her hair was expensively set, her jewelry understated but genuine, her dress that particular shade of expensive black that conveyed both elegance and authority. "Miss Marple," she said, extending a hand. "How splendid that you've come." Miss Marple took her hand briefly. It was cool, and the grip was rather firmer than courtesy required. "I confess I'm curious," Miss Marple said mildly. "Curiosity is a weakness of mine, I'm afraid." "Curiosity," Mrs. Vance said, "is precisely what we need." Behind her, in the drawing room, Miss Marple could see 3 other women, settled in chairs with the comfortable posture of those who had been waiting. Their faces turned toward her with interest, calculation, and something that might have been relief. Miss Marple stepped forward, and Mrs. Vance closed the door behind her. Chapter 2. The Circle of Widows. The drawing room at Rosewood Manor possessed the sort of careful elegance that spoke of considerable expense and considerable calculation. Heavy velvet curtains in deep burgundy framed tall windows overlooking the gardens. A fire burned steadily in the marble fireplace, though the September evening was not particularly cold. Miss Marple observed that the room was deliberately warmed not for comfort, but for a sense of containment, as though warmth might prevent people from leaving. The 3 women rose as she entered. Mrs. Vance made the introductions with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to orchestrating social gatherings. "Miss Marple, allow me to present Mrs. Constance Hartley, our club's treasurer. a woman of perhaps 70, with silver hair worn in an immaculate wave and eyes of a peculiar pale blue. She wore a pearl necklace that caught the firelight, and her smile was practiced, professional. Mrs. Hartley's husband passed some 15 years ago. A terrible loss, Mrs. Hartley murmured, though her voice carried no particular warmth toward the memory. And this is Mrs. Dorothy Fenwick, our secretary, a younger woman, perhaps 50, with the anxious expression of someone accustomed to being overlooked. Her dress was respectable but somewhat worn at the cuffs. Dorothy lost her husband quite recently, only 4 years ago, so she understands the particular weight of fresh grief. Mrs. Fenwick extended a trembling hand. Miss Marple took it gently, noting the calluses on her fingers, the worn wedding ring she still wore despite her widowhood. This was a woman unaccustomed to leisure, accustomed to work. And finally, Mrs. Margaret Ashford, our society's heart and soul. The last woman was perhaps 60, with dark hair touched with grey and an expression that suggested she had once been considered beautiful. There was something almost theatrical about her posture, a languidness that seemed carefully maintained. Margaret lost her beloved husband 8 years ago, though she speaks of him as though he departed yesterday. The heart does not forget, Mrs. Ashford said softly, extending her hand with a gesture that seemed rehearsed. We find great comfort in remembering together. Miss Marple shook her hand and permitted herself to be guided to a wing-back chair near the fire. She accepted a glass of sherry dried good quality and settled herself with the calm demeanor of someone entirely comfortable in unfamiliar situations. Mrs. Vance mentioned the club's purposes. Miss Marple began carefully, though I confess the details were rather vague. Eleanor Vance resumed her seat at the head of the room, her posture suggesting she held this position by both habit and something stronger than mere agreement. The Widows' Club began as an attempt to address a peculiar problem, Eleanor said, her tone becoming almost philosophical. Widowhood is a curious state in modern society. One is neither quite single nor quite married. One exists in a liminal space, often forgotten by friends, overlooked by society. Our club offers something radical, genuine understanding. We are women who have lost the men we built our lives around. We understand the particular loneliness of that loss. How very sensible, Miss Marple said, sipping her sherry. Though I confess I remain puzzled as to why my name appeared among your invitations. I have had no husband to lose. It was Constance Hartley who answered, her pale eyes studying Miss Marple with renewed interest. But you have observed others' losses, haven't you? You live in a village. You see the patterns of human relationships, the consequences of death and abandonment and desperation. That is a form of knowledge we find valuable. There was something almost predatory in the way she said this, and Miss Marple felt the slightest prickling at the back of her neck, that particular sensation that had served her well throughout her long life. The sensation that presented itself when something was not quite as it seemed. I see many things, Miss Marple agreed mildly, though I'm not certain how such observations might serve your club. Perhaps they will simply allow you to understand us better, Eleanor said, rising to gesture toward the dining room. Come, we have much to discuss, and dinner grows cold. The meal was elaborate, roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, wine from a decent vintage. The conversation flowed with practiced ease, the four women speaking of losses, of the kindness of friends, of the particular courage required to continue living after death had visited the household. Miss Marple listened far more than she spoke, her small eyes moving from face to face, noting the patterns in their speech. The things they did not say. Dorothy Fenwick spoke of her husband's illness, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Yet her hands, as she ate, were steady. There was no tremor that suggested fresh grief. Constance Hartley reminisced about travels she and her husband had taken, describing them in such detail and with such assurance that Miss Marple found herself wondering whether the woman had actually experienced these journeys or had simply memorized them from guidebooks. Margaret Ashford wept delicately into her handkerchief, speaking of her husband's kindness, his generosity, his absolute devotion to her happiness. But it was what Eleanor said that caught Miss Marple's attention. When asked about her own husband, Eleanor paused, her expression becoming distant. He was a man of business, she said finally. Very successful. He believed in order, in systems, in the proper arrangement of things. I have tried to carry on his legacy. She paused, lifting her wine glass. The club, in many ways, is his final gift to me, the structure he left behind, the framework within which we operate. After dinner, they retired to a smaller parlour where brandy was served and a card table was arranged. Eleanor suggested they play whist, and the four women took their places with the ease of practice. Miss Marple found herself partnered with Dorothy Fenwick, while Eleanor played opposite with Margaret Ashford. As they played, Eleanor spoke more freely, her tongue loosened slightly by brandy and the intimacy of the game. You know, she said, laying down a card, membership in our club is rather exclusive. Not everyone understands what we do here. Not everyone is worthy of our trust. She looked at Miss Marple across the table. We've had members join us over the years, and most have found our circle precisely what they needed. A place to heal, a place to belong. Most. Miss Marple inquired, playing a trump card with deliberate casualness. Eleanor smiled, but her eyes had become very hard. There have been one or two who left rather suddenly. Women who discovered they preferred solitude to sisterhood. A pity. We invested so much in their understanding. The rooms seemed to grow colder despite. Chapter 3. The Ledger of Names. Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead near midnight, her mind working with the methodical precision of a woman accustomed to sorting truth from pretense. The taxi ride home seemed longer than the journey outward, as though the darkness between Little Bramble and her village had expanded somehow, stretching to accommodate the weight of her observations. She did not sleep well that night. Instead, she sat in her bedroom with her notebook, a small leather journal she had maintained for over 40 years, and recorded her impressions. Not the pleasant conversation about roses and widowhood, but the things she had noticed, the way Eleanor Vance's hands had clenched when discussing departed members, the peculiar fearfulness in Dorothy Fenwick's eyes whenever the older woman spoke, the theatrical quality of Margaret Ashford's grief, as though she were performing sorrow rather than experiencing it. By morning, Miss Marple had decided that curiosity alone was insufficient. Justification for further involvement with the Widows' Club. She needed information. Her first call was to her nephew Raymond, who worked in London in some capacity involving government that he was rather vague about. She waited until a reasonable hour and then reached him at his office. Raymond, dear, I hope I'm not interrupting anything vital, she began in her characteristic manner, which was to say, in a way that made it quite clear she would continue regardless of his answer. Aunt Jane, how lovely to hear from you. Is everything quite all right? Perfectly well. Though I did want to ask you about something rather peculiar. A Mrs. Eleanor Vance, who resides at Rosewood Manor near Little Bramble. She mentioned knowing you. The line went silent for a moment longer than was comfortable. Eleanor Vance, Raymond repeated carefully. I'm not certain. Where did you meet her? She sent me an invitation to join her widows' club. Rather exclusive, apparently. One mentioned you as a mutual acquaintance, which struck me as rather curious, since you're not typically one to discuss family with strangers. Another pause. When Raymond spoke again, his voice had taken on a note of concern that Miss Marple found both reassuring and troubling. Aunt Jane, I would prefer you to have nothing to do with Eleanor Vance. Cannot explain why in detail. Matters are confidential, but I can tell you that she has been associated with several rather unsavory situations. If she's invited you to join something, I would strongly advise declining. How very mysterious, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. But you see, that is precisely why I must know more. One cannot make informed decisions based on vague warnings, however well-intentioned. She heard Raymond sigh on the other end of the line. Very well, but not over the telephone. I'll drive down this weekend. In the meantime, please do nothing that might draw her attention. After she hung up, Miss Marple made herself a pot of tea and sat in her garden, where the afternoon light was turning the leaves of her roses into burnished copper. She had promised to do nothing, but she had not promised to learn nothing. There was a distinction, she felt, that Raymond would appreciate once he understood her reasoning. The village library in Little Bramble opened at 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoons. Miss Marple drove there on Thursday, parking her car with careful precision and entering the building with the confident manner of someone who spent a considerable portion of her life in libraries. The librarian was the woman she had observed locking the doors several days earlier. Her name, according to the small brass plaque on her desk, was Miss Catherine Wells. She was perhaps 60, with the sort of carefully maintained appearance of someone who had worked in a position of modest authority for many years. Good afternoon, Miss Marple said, approaching the desk with a smile of pure warmth. I wonder if you might assist me with some local historical research. I'm attempting to compile information about the various estates in the area, Rosewood Manor in particular. I understand it has quite an interesting history. Miss Wells's expression altered subtly. A wariness entered her eyes, though she maintained her professional demeanor. Rosewood Manor, she repeated. It's an old house. Victorian, I believe. Yes, but I'm more interested in its recent history. The current owner, Mrs. Vance, seems quite established there. I wonder how long she has been in residence. Miss Wells moved toward her filing system with the careful deliberation of someone buying time to think. 3 years, perhaps 4. She came from London, I believe. She keeps to herself largely. Not much involved in village life. How interesting. And before her, the house changed hands several times in the decades before. Old families, mostly. They tend to do that. Country estates, rise and fall. The last family before Mrs. Vance. Miss Wells paused, her fingers hovering over a drawer. The Marchmonts, I believe. They left rather suddenly, if I recall correctly. There was some unpleasantness. Miss Marple leaned forward with the innocent curiosity of an elderly woman with nothing but time. Unpleasantness? How dreadful. What sort of unpleasantness? Miss Wells hesitated, clearly weighing professional discretion against the allure of sharing village gossip with a sympathetic listener. There was a woman, she said finally, her voice lowering. A guest of the family. She disappeared quite suddenly. There was an investigation, but nothing came of it. The family departed shortly afterward. The house stood empty for some years before Mrs. Vance purchased it. The afternoon light streaming through the library windows seemed to dim slightly in Miss Marple's perception, though the sun continued its descent unchanged. "How very mysterious," Miss Marple murmured. "Do you happen to recall when this occurred?" 15 years ago, perhaps 16, 1938 or 1939. It was quite the scandal at the time, though as I say, nothing was ever proven. The woman was simply gone. Some assumed she had run away. Others suspected. Miss Wells trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Suspected what? Miss Marple prompted gently. That something terrible had occurred. But without evidence, without a body, there was nothing the authorities could do. The family left the village, and eventually the house was sold. Miss Marple remained in the library for another hour, requesting old newspapers from the local archive and carefully reviewing them. The articles were sparse, written in the cautious language of journalists uncertain of facts. A Miss Violet Ashford, visiting from London, had disappeared from Rosewood Manor in March 1939. She was described as a woman of independent means, staying with family, friends. The search had been thorough, but ultimately unsuccessful. Eventually, the story had faded from the papers, replaced by larger headlines as war approached. But what struck Miss Marple most forcefully was a single sentence. Buried in a later article, the disappearance remains unsolved. Though some have speculated regarding the financial situation of the house's owners at the time, Miss Ashford was known to be quite wealthy. As Miss Marple replaced the newspapers and thanked Miss Wells for her assistance, her mind was arranging facts like pieces of a puzzle. Eleanor Vance, a woman of business, order and systems. The framework her husband had left behind. And in the back of Miss Marple's notebook, in her small, precise handwriting, she had written a name she had glimpsed in the old articles. The interviewing officer, a young constable at the time, was named Inspector Edward Vance. She drove home through the lengthening shadows of late afternoon, her elderly hand steady on. Chapter 4. The inspector's visitryman arrived on Saturday morning in a state of barely contained agitation. He was a man of 53, with the careful bearing of someone accustomed to weighing words before speaking them, and Miss Marple recognized immediately that whatever he had to tell her had cost him considerable effort to extract from the confidentiality of his position. They sat in her garden, where the roses were beginning their final flourish before autumn claimed them entirely. The morning was crisp, and Miss Marple had provided tea and biscuits. The ordinary rituals that allowed serious conversations to proceed as though they were merely pleasant social exchanges. Eleanor Vance came to our attention approximately 18 months ago. Raymond began without preamble. She was connected to the investigation of a missing woman in Kensington, woman of considerable wealth who had recently widowed and was susceptible to loneliness. The woman invested a substantial sum of money in what she believed to be a private social club. She disappeared shortly after transferring funds. Disappeared, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. You mean she was not found? We mean she has never been located, alive or otherwise. What we discovered during our investigation was that Eleanor Vance had been operating various schemes for nearly 20 years, always targeting wealthy widows, always resulting in the women either disappearing or experiencing sudden financial reversals that left them destitute. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. But surely, with such a clear pattern, one might have prosecuted her. Evidence, Aunt Jane. That is always the difficulty. The women who survived her schemes were often reluctant to speak publicly. Some feared scandal. Others feared her in ways they couldn't articulate. And the women who disappeared, well, without bodies, without clear proof of foul play. The legal system is remarkably limited in what it can do. Raymond paused, his expression hardening. We believe she may be responsible for at least 4 deaths, possibly more. But belief and proof are vastly different matters. And her current residence, Rosewood Manor? We've been monitoring it, quietly. But her operation there is sophisticated. She maintains the appearance of a legitimate social club. Members are vetted carefully. They sign agreements regarding confidentiality. Most importantly, she has managed to cultivate relationships with local authorities that make investigation difficult. Miss Marple rose and walked to her rose garden, examining a particularly fine bloom that had somehow escaped the attention of earlier frosts. You mentioned that she was somehow connected to a constable. 15 years ago, at the same location, Raymond shifted in his chair, surprise crossing his features. How did you? I visited the local library and reviewed old newspapers. A woman named Violet Ashford disappeared from Rosewood Manor in 1939. The investigating officer was named Vance. I assume some connection. Eleanor's husband, Raymond, confirmed quietly. Edward Vance was a policeman, then an inspector. He died 12 years ago under somewhat mysterious circumstances, officially a heart attack while on holiday. Unofficially, there were questions about the company he kept, the money he seemed to have acquired, his involvement in various investigations that somehow never quite reached prosecution. And she inherited his methods, Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than to her nephew. Not merely his estate, but his understanding of how to operate within the system, while remaining untouchable by it, precisely. And now she has refined them. The Widow's Club, as she calls it, is both her hunting ground and her cover. She identifies vulnerable women, offers them companionship and understanding. And then Raymond stopped, his jaw tightening. We're not entirely certain what happens then. The missing women simply cease to exist. But you suspect, we suspect a great many things. Financial exploitation, coercion, possibly murder, though we lack any physical evidence. What we know is that money moves through her accounts in ways that suggest she is extracting funds from these women before they disappear. And we know that the women who are close to her, those she calls her circle, are deeply devoted to her, almost unnaturally so. Miss Marple returned to her seat and regarded her nephew with the full weight of her considerable intelligence. You mentioned that you have been monitoring her quietly. I assume then that you are not here merely to warn me away from the club. You are here because you wish me to accept the invitation. Raymond's expression confirmed this before he spoke. We need someone inside the circle, Aunt Jane. Someone intelligent enough to observe patterns, perceptive enough to understand what is truly occurring. And forgive me, someone whom Eleanor Vance would be unlikely to view as a threat. You fit all of these criteria, but I would not ask it of you if I did not believe your life would be in genuine danger. Life has always contained danger, Miss Marple said calmly. One simply learns to recognize it and proceed accordingly. If this woman has been causing deaths for nearly 20 years without significant consequence, then surely preventing her future victims requires someone willing to take risks. Aunt Jane, I have already accepted the invitation to the October meeting, Miss Marple continued, her tone brooking no argument. I have already made preliminary investigations. I am already, in a sense, involved. The only question is whether I proceed with your support and knowledge, or whether I continue independently and with considerably less assistance." Raymond studied his elderly aunt for a long moment, his expression moving through concern, resignation, and finally, something approaching pride. "If you are to do this," he said quietly, "then there are certain protocols we must establish. You will need to be in contact with me regularly. You will observe and report anything you discover regarding the other members, their interactions, any behavior that seems unusual. You will not, under any circumstances, consume food or drink that you have not personally prepared or that you have not observed being prepared. I will be cautious without being foolish," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "I have lived 83 years by exercising both judgment and prudence, Raymond. I do not intend to abandon either now." They spent the remainder of the afternoon establishing a system of communication. Raymond would call each Tuesday evening, ostensibly to check on his aunt's health. Miss Marple would provide coded reports about the club members, their behavior, and any suspicious activities she observed. If at any point she felt she was in immediate danger, she was to contact the local constabulary directly, and Raymond would arrange for discreet protection after Raymond departed. Miss Marple sat alone in her garden as the afternoon light began its descent into evening. The roses seemed to lean toward her, their final blooms holding the last warmth of the season. She thought of Violet Ashford, disappeared 15 years ago without consequence. She thought of the missing woman in Kensington and the others whose names she did not know. She thought of Dorothy Fenwick's trembling hands and Margaret Ashford's theatrical tears, and she thought of Eleanor Vance, sitting at the head of a drawing room like a spider at the center of an intricate web, waiting for prey to become entangled. The next meeting of the Widows' Club would occur in 4 days. Miss Marple had much to prepare, much to observe, and much to understand before she returned to Rosewood Manor, but she felt no fear, only the peculiar clarity that came to her when the patterns of human behavior, finally, began to arrange themselves into something resembling truth. She picked a rose, a perfect bloom of deep crimson, and carried it inside, to place in water on her writing desk. She would need her strength for what was to come, and she would need her wits. And perhaps, most importantly, she would need to remember that even the most carefully constructed web could be unraveled, if one found the right thread to pull. Chapter 5. The second meeting, the October. Evening arrived with the sort of chill that suggested winter was no longer a distant prospect, but an imminent reality. Miss Marple dressed carefully for her second visit to Rosewood Manor, selecting a dark blue dress that was neither fashionable nor outdated, jewelry that was respectable but modest, and shoes that were practical and well-maintained. She had learned long ago that one's appearance communicated as much as one's words, and she intended to present herself as exactly what she appeared to be: a harmless elderly woman with modest means and genuine curiosity. The drive to Little Bramble seemed shorter this time, though Miss Marple knew this was merely the peculiar quality of anticipation compressing distance in the mind. She arrived 15 minutes before the appointed hour, which allowed her to observe the other guests as they arrived. Constance Hartley came in a hired motor, her pale eyes scanning the circular drive with the assessment of a woman accustomed to evaluating property values. Dorothy Fenwick arrived on foot, having apparently walked from the village despite the increasing darkness, her respectable coat pulled tight against the gathering cold. And Margaret Ashford appeared in a taxi, her movements languid and theatrical, though Miss Marple observed that her eyes were remarkably sharp and calculating as they surveyed the manor's exterior. Eleanor Vance greeted them in the entry hall with the same practiced warmth as before, though Miss Marple detected something new in her manner heightened attention, as though she was studying her guests with unusual intensity. The drawing room had been rearranged slightly. The card table was gone, replaced by comfortable seating arranged in a loose circle. A fire burned in the fireplace, and the room seemed warmer than Miss Marple remembered, almost unnaturally so. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said, taking her hand. "I'm so pleased you returned. Some women find our circle too intimate for their comfort. I'm delighted you are not among them." Miss Marple noticed that Eleanor held her hand slightly longer than was customary, and her grip was firm, almost proprietary. When she released it, Miss Marple felt the faintest tremor in her own fingers, not fear, precisely, but recognition of danger. "Your invitation was quite compelling," Miss Marple said mildly, "and I confess I have found my thoughts returning to our last conversation with some frequency. Have you?" Eleanor's smile deepened. "How fascinating. And what, precisely, has occupied your thoughts?" "The nature of loss," Miss Marple replied carefully, "and the ways in which women, such as ourselves, are left outside the ordinary structures of society once our particular roles have ended." It was exactly what Eleanor wished to hear, and Miss Marple saw the satisfaction flicker across her face before it was carefully concealed. Eleanor guided her to a chair positioned slightly apart from the others, and Miss Marple realized with a start that this was the position that had been occupied by the missing guest, the one who had preferred solitude to sisterhood. Dinner was more elaborate than the previous occasion. A roasted pheasant, vegetables prepared with unusual care, wine that was exceptional. Miss Marple ate sparingly, not from caution alone, but from the observation that the other women seemed to watch her as she ate, as though assessing her reaction to the food. Dorothy Fenwick, in particular, seemed almost anxious that Miss Marple should finish her plate after dinner. As they settled in the drawing room, Eleanor announced that they would engage in a different sort of activity than their previous meeting. "I thought," Eleanor said, moving to a small writing desk in the corner of the room, "that we might share our stories more fully this evening. The details of our lives before loss, the circumstances that brought us to our current situations, the particular vulnerabilities that widowhood has exposed in each of us." She withdrew a leather-bound journal from the desk and held it aloft. "I maintain a record of our circle's histories. It is, in a way, a legacy, a document of our shared understanding." Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken slightly, though she maintained her composed expression. "How interesting," she said, "though I confess I am uncertain what I would contribute. My circumstances are rather different from those of my companions here. But that is precisely why your contribution is valuable," Eleanor said, moving toward her with the journal. "You are an observer, Miss Marple. You have stood outside the institution of marriage and observed it from a distance. You understand loss without having experienced it personally. That perspective is quite rare." Eleanor opened the journal and extended it toward her. Miss Marple accepted it, noting the weight of the leather binding, the quality of the paper. She opened it carefully and found herself looking at pages filled with Eleanor's handwriting, more precise, utterly controlled. The entries were not what she expected. They were not narratives of grief or accounts of widow. Instead, they were detailed observations, physical descriptions, psychological assessments, financial information. Each entry was dated and titled with a woman's name, and beside each name, Miss Marple's breath caught almost imperceptibly, was a single word underlined in red ink. Resolved. The pages were filled with women's names, dozens of them. Each entry meticulously detailed their vulnerabilities, their circumstances, their resources, and each one marked as resolved. "You see," Eleanor said softly, standing very close to Miss Marple, "we are not merely a social club. We are something far more significant. We are a circle of women who understand that some problems require solutions that the ordinary world cannot provide." Miss Marple's mind was working with extraordinary speed, even as her hands remained steady, even as her expression remained neutral. The journal was a confession and a record simultaneously. It was also, she suspected, beta test to see how she would respond to this revelation. "I see," Miss Marple said finally, closing the journal with deliberate care. She extended it back to Eleanor. "You are documenting your work." "Our work," Eleanor corrected, though she did not take the journal immediately. "You see, we have all come to understand certain truths. That society has little use for women in our circumstances. That we are burdensome, invisible, our lives essentially concluded. But what if we could transform that invisibility into power? What if we could cease to be passive victims of our circumstances and instead become active participants in creating the world we wish to inhabit?" Behind Eleanor, Miss Marple observed Constance Hartley watching with clinical interest, Margaret Ashford with something approaching rapture, and Dorothy Fenwick with an expression of profound distress. And if a woman were to refuse to participate in this transformation? Miss Marple asked quietly. Eleanor's smile did not waver, but her eyes became very cold. Then she would have to be considered a threat to our circle. And threats to our circle are not tolerated. In that moment, Miss Marple understood with terrible clarity that she had been right about Eleanor Vance. She also understood that she had made a grave miscalculation in her assessment of the danger she faced. Eleanor had shown her the journal not because she believed Miss Marple would join her cause. She had shown her because Eleanor had already decided what Miss Marple's designation would be in that leather-bound record. Resolved, the words seemed to echo in the drawing room, carried by the crackling fire and the weight of secrets long buried in the gardens of Rosewood Manor. Chapter 6. The Weight of Secrets. Miss Marple's survival in the drawing room of Rosewood Manor that evening depended entirely upon her ability to perform a convincing transformation. She had spent 83 years observing human nature, understanding the precise moment when fear must be transmuted into comprehension, when shock must become calculation. She drew upon this lifetime of knowledge as she met Eleanor Vance's gaze without flinching. "How remarkable," Miss Marple said, her voice steady and thoughtful. "You have created something quite extraordinary. A circle of women who have transcended the limitations of their circumstances and claimed agency in their own lives. It is rather brilliant, actually." Eleanor's expression shifted fractionally. Surprise flickered across her features before being carefully controlled. She had expected resistance, or perhaps fear. She had not expected admiration. "I had begun to suspect that you might be different from the others," Eleanor said slowly, moving toward the fireplace. "That you might possess the necessary clarity of vision. The ability to see beyond society's moral conventions to the fundamental truths of human survival. I have always believed," Miss Marple continued, accepting the brandy that Eleanor now offered her, "that morality is a construct created by those with the luxury of comfort. People in true need often must operate according to different principles entirely." This was not, in fact, what Miss Marple believed. But she had learned that people heard what they wished to hear. And Eleanor Vance was so utterly convinced of her own righteousness that she would interpret Miss Marple's words through the lens of her own ideology. Behind Eleanor, Margaret Ashford's expression had shifted from rapture to something approaching confusion. Constance Hartley's pale eyes had narrowed into calculation, and Dorothy Fenwick had gone absolutely still, her hand frozen halfway to her teacup. "Tell me," Miss Marple said, settling into her chair with the comfort of someone entirely at ease. "How did you come to understand these truths? It could not have been from your husband alone." Edward Vance was a policeman, a man bound by rules and regulations. "How did you transcend those limitations?" Eleanor resumed her seat, and Miss Marple observed that she had moved slightly farther away. A minute adjustment, but significant. Eleanor was reassessing, recalibrating. Good. Edward was a man of considerable imagination, Eleanor said carefully. He understood that the law was a tool, not a master. He understood that certain women required solutions that the law could not provide. I learned from him how to identify vulnerable women, how to gain their trust, how to understand precisely what they possessed that might be of value, and when they refused to cooperate with your solutions. They rarely refused, Eleanor said. Once they understood the alternatives, once they recognized that their lives were essentially concluded, and that they were merely prolonging inevitable suffering, most came to see the wisdom of surrender. Miss Marple set down her brandy glass with deliberate care. Surrender. What a curious word choice. One assumes you mean something more specific than mere capitulation. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, the October wind pressed against the windows of Rosewood Manor as though seeking entry. Eleanor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You are far more perceptive than I anticipated," she said finally, "which presents me with a problem." "Does it?" Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, almost conversational. "I should think it presents you with an opportunity. Surely, a woman of your intelligence and accomplishment would welcome the possibility of genuine understanding with another woman of similar perception. How tedious it must be to surround yourself only with those whose comprehension remains limited." It was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation, and Miss Marple executed it with the precision of a surgeon. She was appealing to the one vulnerability that women like Eleanor Vance possess: the desperate need to be understood, to be appreciated, to be recognized as exceptional. Eleanor's entire enterprise was built upon the satisfaction of that need. The seduction of lonely women into her circle through the promise of being truly seen for the first time in their lives. "You believe you could understand what I have created here?" Eleanor asked, leaning forward with renewed interest. "I believe I could attempt it," Miss Marple replied, "though I confess I remain uncertain about certain specifics." "When you marked these women as resolved, what precisely did you resolve?" It was a dangerous question, one that walked the knife's edge between demonstrating understanding and revealing the limits of her knowledge. Eleanor studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing whether Miss Marple represented an asset or a liability. "They chose to leave," Eleanor said finally, "to depart from the club, to remove themselves from our circle. It was their decision, made freely, though I confess I encouraged them toward that choice. Once they were gone, once they were no longer part of our structure, we had no further responsibility for their welfare." It was, Miss Marple realized, technically a confession to nothing provable. Eleanor had admitted to encouraging women to leave, but not to causing their deaths. And yet the careful phrasing, the studied vagueness, the almost clinical detachment, these suggested far darker truths beneath the surface. "And the women currently in your circle?" Miss Marple asked. "Are they aware of this practice?" "They understand that our membership is exclusive," Eleanor said, "that those who cannot appreciate the depth of what we have created here are invited to depart. Margaret and Constance have been with me for many years. They are entirely committed to our work. Dorothy is newer, still adjusting to the demands of true sisterhood." As if on cue, Dorothy Fenwick made a small sound, something between a whimper and a gasp. Eleanor turned toward her with an expression of such cold disappointment that Miss Marple felt her own protective instincts rise sharply. "Dorothy, dear, is something troubling you?" Eleanor's voice was honey smooth, but edged with something far more dangerous. "No," Dorothy whispered, "nothing. The hour is growing late, and I have a headache." "How unfortunate," Eleanor said. "Constance, perhaps you might accompany Dorothy to the library. I believe the quiet there might help her condition." Miss Marple watched as Constance rose smoothly and placed a hand on Dorothy's shoulder, a gesture that appeared solicitous, but which caused Dorothy to flinch almost imperceptibly. As they left the room, Miss Marple made a crucial observation. Constance's grip on Dorothy's arm was not gentle, and Dorothy's exit from the drawing room bore an uncomfortable resemblance to compulsion rather than choice. "Your concern for Dorothy is touching," Miss Marple observed once they were alone. "Though I wonder if she shares your vision for the club's purposes." "Dorothy will come to understand," Eleanor said, her attention returning fully to Miss Marple. "Everyone does, eventually. Or they leave. There is really no middle ground in a circle such as ours. One must commit entirely to the truth of what we have created, or one cannot remain, and those who commit entirely, what becomes of them?" Eleanor rose and moved toward the window, her silhouette black against the darkness beyond the glass. "They become part of something transcendent. They cease to be forgotten, invisible women. They become essential to a great work. Is that not what every woman in our circumstances truly desires? To matter, to be necessary, to be part of something that will endure after death has finally claimed her." Miss Marple rose as well, recognizing that the evening had reached its natural conclusion. "You have given me much to consider. I wonder if I might return home and reflect upon what you have shared. Such profound revelations require time for proper digestion." Eleanor turned from the window, and in the firelight, her expression was almost tender. "Of course. You are a thoughtful woman, Miss Marple. I suspect that you will come to the proper conclusions regarding your place in our circle. And when you do, I hope you will embrace it with the fullness of understanding." As Miss Marple's taxi wound down the drive away from Rosewood Manor, she forced her trembling hands to remain still in her lap. She had survived the evening, but she had also confirmed what she had suspected. Eleanor Vance was not merely a murderer. She was a true believer in her own mythology. A woman convinced that she was performing a sacred duty, and somewhere in Rosewood Manor's gardens, buried beneath carefully tended roses and ornamental hedges, lay the evidence of her devotion. The question now was not whether Miss Marple could prove Eleanor's crimes. The question was whether she could do so before Eleanor decided that an inconvenient observer had become a threat to be resolved. Chapter 7. The Garden's Secret. Miss Marple did not sleep that night. She sat in her armchair, her small hands folded in her lap, and allowed her mind to work through the patterns she had observed. The leather journal with its meticulous records, the careful phrasing that admitted nothing while confessing everything, the way Eleanor spoke of resolution as though it were a spiritual concept rather than a practical one, and most crucially, the absolute certainty in Eleanor's voice that she was performing necessary work when dawn broke over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple rose and dressed with deliberate precision. She had several telephone calls to make, and they required a clarity of purpose that only daylight could provide. Her first call was to Raymond, made from the telephone in her sitting room at an hour early enough that he would still be at home. "You must listen carefully," she said without preamble when he answered. "I have confirmed that Eleanor Vance is maintaining detailed records of her victims. A leather journal, kept in her study at Rosewood Manor. It contains names, dates, and a cryptic notation beside each the word resolved. I believe these are the women who have disappeared." Raymond's voice, when he responded, was sharp with alarm. "Aunt Jane, you must not." "I must, and I have," Miss Marple interrupted. "But there is more. She is holding at least one woman against her will. Dorothy Fenwick, widowed 4 years ago. She arrived at the club meeting on foot, departed in the company of Constance Hartley under what appeared to be physical restraint. I fear for her safety. We will move on this immediately. I will contact the local constabulary and arrange for you will do nothing of the sort," Miss Marple said quietly, but with unmistakable authority. "Any official action at this juncture will either drive Eleanor to eliminate evidence, which includes Dorothy Fenwick, will provide her with opportunity to claim victimhood and legal protection through her various connections. We require proof that cannot be disputed. Then what do you propose?" "I propose," Miss Marple said, "that I return to Rosewood Manor, socially, independently, during daylight hours. I wish to speak with Eleanor about membership, to indicate that I am prepared to commit to her circle. Such a commitment, I suspect, requires certain rituals, certain demonstrations of loyalty. Absolutely not. Aunt Jane, you are describing a suicide mission. I am describing a reconnaissance, Miss Marple replied. Eleanor Vance is confident that she has assessed me correctly. She believes I am coming to understand her vision, perhaps even to embrace it. That confidence is her vulnerability. She will permit me access to areas of Rosewood Manor that she might otherwise keep private. She will speak more freely with someone she believes she is converting to her cause. After considerable argument, Raymond reluctantly agreed to allow her to proceed, though he insisted upon establishing a signal system whereby Miss Marple would contact him within 2 hours of leaving Rosewood Manor. If she failed to do so, he would contact the police immediately. It was a Thursday morning when Miss Marple drove to Little Bramble. She had chosen the time deliberately late enough that Eleanor would likely be at home, early enough that the day held the promise of light lasting several hours. She dressed in her most respectable clothing, conservative and composed, and she brought with her a small handbag containing a notebook, a fountain pen, and a silver locket containing a photograph of her parents. Eleanor seemed delighted rather than surprised by her arrival. "Miss Marple," she said, greeting her at the door with genuine warmth that somehow made the situation more unsettling rather than less. "What a lovely surprise. I had hoped you might visit again soon. Have you come to discuss your place in our circle?" "I have come," Miss Marple said carefully, "to request a tour of Rosewood Manor. I find myself curious about the house itself. It seems to possess considerable history, and I would like to understand the space that has become so important to your work." Eleanor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something calculating moving behind her eyes, but she smiled and extended her hand in invitation. "Of course. I would be delighted to show you everything." The tour began innocuously. Enough the drawing room, the dining room, the library where Miss Marple noted Eleanor kept her financial records in an unlocked desk drawer. But it was Eleanor's study that revealed the most significant details. The leather journal sat openly on her writing desk, as though she no longer felt the need to conceal it. Beside it lay a small metal box, ornate and locked, which Eleanor did not open, but which Miss Marple suspected contained keys or documents of considerable importance. "I keep my records here," Eleanor explained, running her fingers across the journal's leather binding. "Every member of our circle is documented. Every step of their journey toward understanding is carefully recorded. It is a legacy, you see, a proof of the work we have accomplished. May I?" Miss Marple asked, gesturing toward the journal. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before handing it to her. Miss Marple opened it to a random page and found herself looking at an entry dated 3 years earlier. The name was Margaret Ashford, the same Margaret Ashford who currently attended the club meetings. But beneath her name was written not the word resolved, but rather a detailed account of her financial assets, her property holdings, and a cryptic notation: dependent, compliant, necessary. "Margaret has been with you for some time," Miss Marple observed. "Margaret was my first," Eleanor said, and there was something almost tender in her voice. "She came to me when her husband died, utterly lost, entirely without purpose. I showed her that her life could have meaning again, that she could be part of something transcendent. She has been entirely grateful for that gift, and the others." The women marked as resolved. Eleanor took the journal back and turned to the final pages. They could not see what Margaret saw. They could not surrender their old identities, their old selves. They clung to the remnants of their previous lives, even as those lives no longer contained any genuine purpose. I helped them move beyond that attachment. I helped them find peace. The euphemism hung in the air like a physical presence. Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. And if someone were to question your methods, Miss Marple asked quietly, if someone were to suggest that your work was not what you believed it to be, Eleanor's expression hardened. Then they would be rejecting truth for comfortable lies. They would be choosing to remain blind rather than to see clearly. And I cannot allow such people to remain within my circle. The circle must be pure. It must contain only those who understand. I understand, Miss Marple said softly, but as she spoke those words, Eleanor was studying her with renewed intensity, as though hearing something in her tone that contradicted the words themselves. A moment of terrible clarity seemed to pass between them, a moment in which Eleanor recognized that Miss Marple's understanding was fundamentally different from her own. Perhaps, Eleanor said slowly, we should visit the gardens. You have expressed no curiosity about them, and I find that curious indeed. Most women are fascinated by my gardens. Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken, but she maintained her composure. I would be delighted to see them. The gardens of Rosewood Manor were indeed spectacular. Rose gardens arranged with mathematical precision. Hedges trimmed into elaborate shapes. Pathways of fine gravel leading toward various garden rooms. But what Miss Marple noticed most forcefully was the earth itself. In several locations, the soil appeared disturbed, the roses replanted multiple times. One particular section of the garden, near the boundary wall, showed signs of recent excavation. The earth was slightly raised, the grass newer. The plantings arranged with the careful intention of someone attempting to conceal a disturbance. You have been quite busy with your gardening, Miss Marple observed, gesturing toward the disturbed area. I find gardening meditative, Eleanor replied. The act of planting, of nurturing growth from the soil, it connects one to fundamental truths about life and renewal. Each of my gardens contains someone I have loved. They return to the earth, and from that earth, beauty grows. Is that not a more meaningful legacy than to simply decay in some cemetery, forgotten and unmourned? Miss Marple understood then with absolute certainty. The women marked as resolved were not dead in some distant location. They were here, buried beneath Eleanor's carefully tended roses. Their bodies returned to the earth that had nourished the very flowers that grew above them. Eleanor was not merely a murderer. She was a true believer in her own mythology of transformation. How beautiful, Miss Marple said, her voice steady despite the horror crystallizing within her. And how permanent. Eleanor turned to her with an expression of such satisfaction that Miss Marple knew she had made a critical error. Her words had been interpreted not as condemnation, but as capitulation. Eleanor believed that Miss Marple had finally understood, finally embraced the terrible beauty of what she had created. And as for Miss Marple herself, she had just demonstrated an understanding that Eleanor could no longer afford to leave untouched. She had perhaps minutes to formulate a plan that would preserve both her life and Dorothy's, while ensuring that Eleanor Vance finally faced the justice that had eluded her for so long. Chapter 8. The cellar's truth. Eleanor led Miss Marple through corridors she had not previously traversed, descending a narrow staircase that spiraled downward beneath the main structure of Rosewood Manor. The air grew cooler, damper, carrying the particular scent of underground space, earth and stone and something else. something that made Miss Marple's instincts scream in warning even as her outward composure remained unshaken. The cellar was far more extensive than Miss Marple would have anticipated. Electric lights had been installed, casting everything in harsh illumination that somehow made the space feel more sinister rather than less. There were storage rooms lined with wine racks, rooms containing old furniture, and then a door that Eleanor opened with a key from her pocket, a door that led into a space that had been converted into something between a bedroom and a prison. Dorothy Fenwick sat on a narrow bed, her hands folded in her lap, her expression empty of everything except a profound and devastating resignation. When she saw Miss Marple, something flickered in her eyes. Hope, perhaps, or the final extinguishing of hope. "Dorothy," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the tone of a woman introducing guests at a social gathering. "This is Miss Marple. I believe she may be joining our circle permanently. I thought you might appreciate meeting her before you move into your next phase of understanding." "Next phase," Miss Marple repeated carefully, her eyes never leaving Dorothy's face. She could see the signs of captivity, now the pallor, the slight tremor in Dorothy's hands. The way her eyes tracked Eleanor's movements with the wariness of prey watching a predator. "Dorothy has come to understand," Eleanor explained, moving to a table that held a teapot and several cups, "that her attachment to her previous life is preventing her from achieving peace. She has agreed to undertake a period of contemplation, a time of complete separation from the external world, during which she can fully process her grief and prepare for her ultimate transformation." Eleanor poured tea into one of the cups and extended it toward Dorothy. Miss Marple observed the other woman's hesitation, the way Dorothy's hand trembled as she accepted the cup, the way she did not drink from it immediately. "How long has Dorothy been in this phase of contemplation?" Miss Marple asked. 3 weeks, Eleanor replied. "Though time becomes rather meaningless in such circumstances, doesn't it? Day and night blur together. The mind becomes freed from the tyranny of schedule and obligation. It is quite liberating, really." 3 weeks. Miss Marple's mind calculated rapidly. 3 weeks without sunlight, without communication, without freedom. And whatever was in that teapot, Miss Marple observed that Eleanor had not poured cups for herself or for Miss Marple, only for Dorothy, was clearly part of the process. "I see," Miss Marple said softly. Then, with the sudden decisiveness that had served her well throughout her life, she turned to Eleanor. "I must confess something to you, Mrs. Vance. I am not entirely what I have presented myself to be." Eleanor's expression shifted, wariness replacing satisfaction. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I have come to Rosewood Manor under somewhat false pretenses. My nephew, who works in a government capacity, has been investigating your activities for some time. He became concerned when you sent me an invitation and asked me to accept it, to gather information about your circle." The words hung between them, and Miss Marple watched as Eleanor processed them. She saw the moment when rage began to emerge, quickly suppressed by something far more dangerous, the calm certainty of someone whose elaborate structure had begun to crack, but who believed she could still control the damage. "How unfortunate," Eleanor said finally, moving towards the tea table. "And how typical of the sort of interference I have come to expect from those too limited in vision to understand what I have created." Eleanor's hand moved toward a shelf above the table, and Miss Marple saw her grasp a small bottle amber-colored glass, the contents unknown but clearly significant. A tincture of some kind. Something that could be added to tea. "You cannot drug me," Miss Marple said calmly. "My nephew expects me to telephone him within the hour. If I do not make contact, the police will arrive at Rosewood Manor with a warrant. Your games, Mrs. Vance, are finished, are they?" Eleanor turned back to face her, and in her eyes Miss Marple saw something that transcended mere madness. It was the absolute conviction of someone who had successfully operated outside the law for so long that she had come to believe herself beyond its reach. "My connections run far deeper than you comprehend. The police inspector in this district is an old friend of my late husband's. The magistrate owes me considerable favors. Even your nephew's government position will not protect him from the reach of those who understand how to operate within systems." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed. "But you have made one critical error, Mrs. Vance. You have allowed me to see Dorothy Fenwick alive. You have allowed me to witness the cellar, the tea, your intentions. You have been so confident in your invulnerability that you have forgotten to conceal the evidence of your crimes." Eleanor's expression hardened. "Then I suppose I have no choice but to ensure that you are unable to communicate those observations to anyone. What occurred in the following seconds would later be a matter of some dispute in Miss Marple's recounting to Raymond. She would say that she had anticipated Eleanor's move, that the older woman had been trained by her husband in methods of violence, had practiced them numerous times before. She would say that she had stepped aside at precisely the correct moment, that Eleanor's lunge toward her had instead carried her toward the metal shelf, that Eleanor had struck her head against the corner of the table with unfortunate force. But the truth, which Miss Marple would never admit to anyone, was that her survival had depended upon Dorothy Fenwick. The moment Eleanor's attention had shifted from her prisoner to her new threat, Dorothy had acted with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. She had thrown the teacup, scalding and full, directly into Eleanor's face. She had pushed herself forward with the momentum of absolute commitment, and she had ensured, through her own bravery, that Eleanor Vance would not achieve her intended outcome. Eleanor lay on the cellar floor, blood trickling from her temple, her breathing shallow and irregular. Miss Marple moved to Dorothy immediately, taking her hands, helping her to her feet. "We must leave this place," Miss Marple said firmly. "Can you walk?" Dorothy nodded, though her legs were unsteady. Miss Marple supported her as they climbed the cellar stairs, her elderly frame somehow finding reserves of strength it did not know it possessed. At the top of the stairs, they encountered Constance Hartley emerging from the kitchen. For a moment, the three women stood frozen in a tableau of profound consequence. Constance's pale eyes moved from Eleanor's unconscious form visible through the cellar door, to Dorothy's disheveled state, to Miss Marple's resolute expression, and in that moment, something extraordinary occurred. Constance Hartley stepped aside, clearing the path toward the exit. "I have been waiting for someone like you to come," she said quietly to Miss Marple. "For years, I have waited for someone brave enough to stop her. I could not do it myself. I was too much her creation. But you came from outside. Go, leave this place. I will ensure that the appropriate authorities are contacted." Miss Marple did not hesitate. She led Dorothy through the corridors of Rosewood Manor and out into the October afternoon, where the light seemed impossibly bright after the cellar's artificial illumination. They reached her motorcar, and Miss Marple drove carefully but with urgency toward the police station in Little Bramble. Within the hour, Rosewood Manor was surrounded by constables. Within 2 hours, Raymond had arrived with government officials. Within 3 hours, the gardens of Rosewood, Manor had begun to yield their terrible secrets, the carefully buried remains of women who had believed themselves part of an exclusive circle but had instead become part of Eleanor Vance's grotesque legacy. And in her Chapter 9, The Reckoning, the investigation of Rosewood Manor proceeded with the methodical thoroughness that only official machinery could provide. Within the first week, the gardens had yielded 7 bodies, 7 women whose disappearances had been officially recorded as voluntary departures, suicide, or simple abandonment. The leather journal that Eleanor Vance had so proudly displayed to Miss Marple became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Each carefully documented entry, a confession written in Eleanor's own hand. Miss Marple found herself, rather against her preference for obscurity, at the center of considerable attention. Solicitors representing various estates wanted to understand what she knew about the missing women's final dispositions. Police inspectors requested detailed accounts of her conversations with Eleanor. Raymond's superiors expressed their gratitude in terms that suggested her contributions would be noted in official records she would never see. But what occupied Miss Marple's attention most thoroughly was Dorothy Fenwick, the woman who emerged from the cellar of Rosewood Manor. Was not the same Dorothy who had entered it 3 weeks earlier. She was thinner, her hair had begun to grey at an accelerated rate, and her eyes held the particular hollowness of someone who had stared into an abyss and only narrowly avoided falling into it. The local physician, examining her, declared her physically sound, malnourished, certainly, and suffering from the effects of prolonged confinement, but free from permanent physical damage. The psychological damage, however, was considerably more complex. Miss Marple visited her at the cottage near the village, where Dorothy had gone to stay with a distant cousin. It was a modest house, respectable and safe, though Dorothy seemed to find little comfort in its sanctuary. She sat in a chair near the window, her hands perpetually occupied with some form of needlework that never seemed to progress, her eyes distant and unfocused. "How are you managing?" Miss Marple asked gently, settling into the chair opposite. "I am surviving," Dorothy replied, which was not quite the same thing as recovering. "The police have informed me that Eleanor's estate will be liquidated and distributed to the families of her victims. There will be a considerable sum, apparently, enough that I need never worry about finances again. Enough that I could leave this village, start anew somewhere else. And will you?" Miss Marple asked, Dorothy's hands stilled on her needlework. "I have been thinking about that. About leaving, about trying to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. And I have come to realize that I cannot. This village, this cottage, this very ordinary existence, it is the only thing that makes me feel as though I am still alive. Eleanor wanted to take even that from me, you see. She wanted me to surrender my attachment to the external world, to embrace her vision of peace through oblivion. I cannot leave Little Bramble. To do so would be to acknowledge that she succeeded, at least partially. In her design, Miss Marple understood what Dorothy was not saying aloud, that remaining in Little Bramble was a form of resistance, an insistence upon life and continuity despite Eleanor's best efforts to erase it. The trial of Eleanor Vance took place in November, conducted with all the formality and public interest that such a case commanded. 7 counts of murder, though Eleanor herself never spoke a word in her own defense. She sat in the dock, her appearance immaculate, her expression serene, as though the proceedings were happening to someone else entirely. What emerged during the testimony was a portrait of systematic predation, extending back nearly 30 years. Eleanor had begun her work, it seemed, under her husband's direction. Edward Vance, before his death, had refined the methods by which vulnerable women could be identified, isolated, and eliminated without attracting official attention. He had used his position as a policeman to ensure that investigations into missing persons went nowhere. And when he died, Eleanor had simply continued his work, perfecting the systems he had established. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge, visibly disturbed by the nature of the crimes, sentenced Eleanor Vance to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Eleanor received the sentence with the same serene expression she had maintained throughout the trial. As she was being led away, she looked directly at Miss Marple sitting in the gallery, and for a moment something flickered in her eyes, not recognition, precisely, but acknowledgement. The gaze of one woman who understood human nature to another who had finally proven her understanding by disrupting Eleanor's carefully constructed world. Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the nature of evil as she returned to St. Mary Mead in the weeks following the trial. Evil, she had long believed, was not always the province of those who lacked intelligence or sophistication. Sometimes it emerged from minds of considerable brilliance, minds capable of rationalizing the unjustifiable, of transforming murder into philosophy, of convincing both perpetrator and victim that horror was actually enlightenment. Eleanor Vance had not been mad in any clinical sense. She had been, instead, something far more dangerous, true believer in her own ideology. She had convinced herself that she was performing a service, that the women whose lives she had stolen were the beneficiaries of her actions. And in that conviction, she had found the justification necessary to continue. It was this aspect of the case that troubled Miss Marple most deeply as autumn turned toward winter, and the village of St. Mary Mead settled back into its ordinary rhythms. The roses in her garden had finally surrendered to the frost, their petals falling like snow upon the frozen earth. She stood among them one December morning, her small frame wrapped in a heavy coat, and allowed herself to contemplate what might have happened if she had refused Eleanor's invitation. If she had remained safely ensconced in her cottage, observing the world but not intervening in it. Raymond had suggested, gently, that she had been fortunate to survive her encounter with Eleanor. He had suggested that she might consider whether such risks were appropriate for a woman of her age. But Miss Marple had come to understand something in the aftermath of Rosewood, manner that she had perhaps always known but never quite articulated. Observation without action was complicity. To see evil and turn away from it was to become, in some small way, participant in that evil's continuation. She had spent 83 years observing human nature, observing the patterns, the behaviors, the small betrayals and catastrophes that played out in village life. And in all that observation, she had been preparing herself for the moment when observation would no longer be sufficient. Eleanor Vance represented everything that Miss Marple had come to understand about the human capacity for self-deception. But more importantly, she represented what could happen when such deception was allowed to flourish unchecked, when the machinery of justice was corrupted or compromised, when women who were already marginalized by society were rendered further invisible through predatory practices. As Miss Marple walked back toward her cottage, leaving the frozen garden behind, she found herself thinking not of Eleanor but of Dorothy. Dorothy, who had found the courage to act in the moment when action was most desperately needed. Dorothy, who had chosen survival and resistance over the surrender that Eleanor had been attempting to impose. Dorothy, who would spend the rest of her life rebuilding what Eleanor had nearly destroyed. That, Miss Marple thought, was the true resolution to the mystery of the Widows' Club, not the capture of a murderer, or the recovery of stolen property, or the restoration of social order. The true resolution was the affirmation that even in the darkest circumstances, even when confronted with seemingly absolute power, there remained the possibility of resistance, of defiance, of choosing life over the death that others would impose. The winter evening was settling over. St. Mary Mead, as Miss Marple settled into her armchair with her knitting. The needles clicked with their familiar rhythm, a sound that had accompanied her through 83 years of observing, understanding, and occasionally intervening in the affairs of others. She had done what needed to be done. The machinery of justice was now in motion. Eleanor Vance would spend her remaining years in confinement, and the women she had victimized would receive something approaching closure. It was not perfect. Justice never was. But it was, Miss Marple reflected, sufficient. And sometimes, in a world as complex and morally ambiguous as the one she had long inhabited, sufficiency was the closest one could come to peace. Chapter 10. Reflections. In winter 6 months had passed since Eleanor Vance had been led away from the courthouse to begin her life sentence at Holloway Prison. The seasons had turned. Winter had surrendered to spring, and St. Mary Mead had gradually returned to the comfortable rhythms that characterized village life. Yet for Miss Marple, something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of her understanding, not of the world, precisely, but of her place within it. She received a letter in late April, delivered by the post with the ordinary stamps and postmarks of regular correspondence. The handwriting was unfamiliar, educated, bearing the careful formation of someone who had learned penmanship in an era that valued precision above speed. It was from Constance Hartley. Dear Miss Marple, I hope this letter finds you in good health and spirits. I have taken the liberty of writing to you because I believe you are one of the few people in the world who might understand what I am attempting to communicate. In the months following Eleanor's arrest, I have been engaged in what one might charitably describe as a process of reckoning. The authorities have been remarkably generous in their treatment of me, acknowledging that I was, in many ways, as much a prisoner of Eleanor's ideology as Dorothy was a prisoner of her physical circumstances. I have been permitted to remain in the community under certain conditions, and I have used this time to attempt to understand how it was that I became complicit in such darkness. The truth, Miss Marple, is that I knew what Eleanor was doing, what the resolutions truly meant, what lay beneath the roses in her gardens, and I participated in her work not because I was forced, not because I lacked the intelligence to recognize the truth, but because Eleanor had offered me something I had wanted for so long that I was willing to overlook the cost of obtaining it. She had offered me the experience of being necessary, of being essential, of mattering in a world that had, after my husband's death, rendered me invisible. Eleanor understood this about me. She understood that widowhood had stripped away my identity so completely that I would accept almost any alternative identity she offered, no matter how morally compromised. She understood that the promise of belonging, of being part of a circle, of having purpose again, was worth more to me than my conscience. I write to you because I wish you to understand that, Eleanor. Vance's greatest victory was not in the murders she committed, though those are certainly crimes of devastating magnitude. Her greatest victory was in her ability to corrupt those around her, to transform good women into accomplices, to make us complicit in our own moral degradation, by offering us the one thing we could not refuse, the promise of relevance. I am attempting to live differently now. I have applied to work with a charitable organization that assists widows in difficult circumstances. It is modest work, and it will never restore what I have lost or undo what I have allowed to occur. But it is, I believe, the only meaningful response available to me. I hope you will find it in your heart to forgive me, though I acknowledge that forgiveness is not something I have earned. Respectfully, Constance Hartley. Miss Marple read the letter 3 times, sitting in her garden as the April afternoon moved toward evening. She allowed herself to consider whether Constance's words represented genuine remorse, or simply a more sophisticated form of the self-deception that had characterized Eleanor's ideology. But after considerable reflection, she concluded that the distinction mattered far less than the fact that Constance had recognized her own complicity and was attempting to atone for it. She wrote a response that same evening, year brief, kind letter that did not offer absolution but did acknowledge the difficulty of the journey Constance had undertaken. She posted it the following morning. Dorothy Fenwick's recovery proceeded more slowly than the legal process that had brought Eleanor to justice. Miss Marple called upon her regularly, watching as the woman gradually began to invest herself in the ordinary activities of village life. By late spring, Dorothy had taken a position. Assisting the vicar with the church accounts work was modest, but that seemed to provide her with structure and purpose. It was during one of these visits that Dorothy finally spoke about what had occurred in the cellar with a degree of honesty that suggested genuine healing had begun. I have been thinking about what she attempted to take from me, Dorothy said, her hands engaged in their perpetual needlework, but her eyes finally focused on something present rather than distant. Not simply my life, though that is certainly what she was attempting, but something more fundamental: my attachment to ordinary things, my appreciation for the simple fact of existing, of breathing, of watching the seasons change. Eleanor believed that our existence as widows was essentially concluded, that we were living in a perpetual epilogue to our actual lives. And do you believe that now? Miss Marple asked gently. No, Dorothy said with quiet conviction. I have come to understand that life does not end when one's husband dies. It transforms. The structure changes. The meaning must be reconstructed. But life itself continues. And in that continuation there is value, there is possibility. There is the potential for genuine growth and understanding. By summer, Dorothy had joined the village library committee and had begun organizing reading groups for widows in the surrounding area, not to provide support for grief, precisely, but to offer intellectual companionship, shared engagement with literature and ideas, the affirmation that their minds remained vital and valuable. As for Eleanor Vance herself, she remained in Holloway Prison. Housed in segregation for her own protection, her crimes had attracted considerable attention, and other prisoners held her in something approaching terror. Prison records indicated that she had never spoken since the moment of her arrest. She sat in her cell, engaged in some form of internal contemplation that observers found both fascinating and deeply disturbing. It was Raymond who brought Miss Marple the final piece of information regarding Eleanor's case. He visited in late August, bringing with him documentation that had emerged from the investigation of Eleanor's financial records. The money, he explained, settling into her sitting room with tea was only part of her motivation. What we eventually discovered was that Eleanor had been documenting her work not merely for her own satisfaction, but with the intention of creating a kind of legacy. She maintained correspondence with at least 3 other women in different parts of England and Scotland who appear to have been engaged in similar activities. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful deliberation. "You mean to say that Eleanor Vance was not operating independently?" "We mean to say," Raymond corrected gently, "that there appears to be a network of women who have adopted Eleanor's ideology and methods. We are currently investigating 3 separate cases in other jurisdictions. Eleanor may have been the most prolific, but she was not unique." The implications of this revelation occupied Miss Marple's thoughts for many weeks following Raymond's departure. It suggested that the problem of Eleanor Vance was not an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of something far more systemic, a widespread vulnerability among certain women that could be exploited by those sufficiently clever and utterly without moral restraint. She began to occupy herself with correspondence, letters to women she had known throughout her life, queries about widows in their communities, attempts to understand whether there were patterns that might suggest similar predatory networks. Most of her correspondents thought her concern was excessive, even morbid. But a few, particularly a woman named Miss Emily Hartland, who lived in the Cotswolds, and who had her own reputation for sharp observation, began to provide her with information about suspicious deaths, sudden disappearances, and women whose circumstances had altered dramatically following recruitment into exclusive social organizations. By autumn, Miss Marple had compiled a notebook of observations that suggested Raymond's fears might be justified. There appeared to be at least 4 other networks operating with similar methods to Eleanor, though none had yet been prosecuted, and most operated with sufficient discretion that official proof remained elusive. It was this realization that finally prompted Miss Marple to do something she had never done before. She wrote directly to the Home Secretary, documenting her observations, providing her analysis, and suggesting that a coordinated national investigation might be warranted. She did not expect a response. Such letters were typically acknowledged by minor functionaries and filed away without serious consideration. But she wrote it nonetheless, because the alternative was to remain silent, and silence had become something she could no longer afford. To her considerable surprise, she received a response within the month. An official inquiry had been initiated. Several of the networks she had identified were being investigated. As autumn settled over St. Mary Mead, with the roses returning to their dormancy and the village settling into winter's approach, Miss Marple reflected on how thoroughly her life had been altered by a single invitation to a widow's club. She had intended to observe, to gather information, to aid in the arrest of a dangerous criminal. But what had emerged instead was recognition of a far larger problem. The understanding that evil was not always dramatic or sensational, that it often operated within the most respectable of frameworks, and that vigilance, constant, careful, unsentimental vigilance was the price of maintaining a just society. She was still observing, still noting patterns, still arranging the observations into frameworks that might reveal truth. But observation had been transformed by action into something more urgent, more necessary, more fundamentally important than it had ever been before. The village went about its business largely unaware that Miss Marple had become something beyond a harmless elderly woman with an interest in village gossip. She had become, in the quiet way that such transformations typically occurred, a guardian of a particular kind, not enforcing order through official mechanisms, but ensuring through careful observation and discreet intervention that those who preyed upon the vulnerable did not go unchallenged. It was not the life she had anticipated living in her 83rd year, but as she settled into her chair with her knitting on a cold November evening, listening to the wind press against her cottage walls, Miss Marple found herself content with this unexpected conclusion. She had been tested by Eleanor Vance and had not faltered. She had glimpsed the darkness that lay beneath respectable surfaces and had chosen to illuminate it, rather than ignore it, and in that choice, she had discovered that observation and action, properly combined, could be a formidable force against the particular evils that festered in the shadows of ordinary life.